What did Martin Luther mean when he said in his speech, "I have a dream"? Wait. Are we talking about Martin Luther or Martin Luther King Jr.? Was the diet of worms really a faddish weight loss system? I'm Professor Jerome Markenberg, and I'll answer this and other questions right after this. Hi, Professor Ark here, and I've been teaching a wide variety of history courses at colleges all across this country for the past 30 years. In this video, I'm going to tell you all about who the heck Martin Luther was and what his beef was with the Catholic Church. How Luther was able to escape the Inquisition. How preoccupation with French and Turkish wars kept both Pope and Emperor from wiping out the German Protestants. What these German Protestants preached. And who the hell was John Calvin? At the end, I'll have the wrap-up quote on this video. But first, make sure to click like, share, and subscribe, and the little bell thingy, so I can continue to bring you more great videos just like this one. The Reformation began as just another dispute over papal claims to supremacy. It was really quite medieval. But it's one which in the end destroyed Europe's religious unity, unwittingly making possible both European supremacy and the triumph of democracy. Born to the knightly class, one day while studying law, Martin Luther, whose dates are from 1483 to 1546, was struck by lightning in a thunderstorm, just like St. Paul had been on the road to Damascus to persecute the Christians. And Luther, of course, knew this, and kind of took it the same way, as a message from God. And this caused him to disappoint his father and become an Augustinian monk. He went on to receive a doctorate in theology at Wittenberg University and taught theology there. Now, in 1517, in October, Luther had already visited Rome twice and been appalled twice by the corruption and really lack of simplicity. Everybody was wearing plenty of bling, fine silk clothes, everything. They had their own prostitutes hanging on them, all sorts of stuff. And then finally, the straw that broke the camel's back, you might say, was the arrival in nearby Magdeburg of the Dominican preacher Fra Tetzel. Tetzel was selling papal indulgences to raise money to build St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, the new one. Now, Tetzel, what an indulgence is, it's kind of like a get-out-of-jail-free card in Monopoly. You buy it, and depending on the level of indulgence that you bought, you can either rise up to a lesser area of hell to suffer in, or get sent straight to purgatory. So you get out of hell entirely. Tetzel was selling this quite illegally. He's kind of like the great TV pitchman of the age. He was telling people that if you bought enough, you could bypass. You could be the most evil person on earth. In fact, his example was that even if you had raped the Blessed Mother, the Virgin Mary herself, if you bought one of these indulgences, the right one, the expensive one, you could still get into heaven. Bypass, not you don't have to worry about hell, but you could bypass purgatory entirely and go straight to heaven. Now, Luther was outraged because this is really an outrageous statement. Tetzel probably knew it, but his goal was to raise as much money as possible. So he said the most outrageous things. Luther decided to invite debate about the Pope's power to issue any indulgences, along with the current-day corruption of the Church in a very time-honored medieval way, by posting his debate positions, his 95 theses, on the door of Wittenberg Cathedral. And today, this is made to be a very dramatic thing, but any church door, local parish church out in the middle of a village, in a hamlet out there in the middle of nowhere, or on a great cathedral, it was kind of like the community bulletin board. Kind of the bulletin board you might get at a local grocery store. Things for sale, pick out your phone number. No phone numbers back then, of course. Come to this meeting, all sorts of stuff. And that was the normal way of doing it. So it's not very dramatic, really. He was an academic. He's a professor. He was expecting an academic debate. Which, if you've ever been to one of them, is pretty damn dull. But a new information technology had just appeared. The printing press. Well, it had been around since about the late 15th century, but the printing press enabled the 95 Theses to quickly circulate through a fairly literate German populace. A good chunk of the people knew how to read. They couldn't write, because that was learned separately, and you learn about that in my video on medieval education. Anyway, this sparks a popular movement deeply based in German anti-papalism. And why were the Germans so ticked off about the popes? Because ever since the Papal Revolution, which had begun in about 1080 AD, the popes had done everything they could to stop Germany from becoming a centralized, powerful state, a state which they thought would threaten them. France becomes centralized, England, Spain, Poland, everywhere else, but Germany wasn't allowed to do so because of the popes. Luther's license to teach, remember you're teaching theology, to do so to the present day. In a Catholic university, which all of them were, there was no university in Europe which was not run by the Catholic Church, except maybe a few in the Muslim states in Spain. Anyway, you needed a license to teach. It was immediately revoked for Luther, and a heresy case against him was initiated. Now, if there hadn't been the theses circulated widely across Germany, this might not have amounted to much. After all, St. Thomas Aquinas, had been accused of heresy himself, had been convicted of it, and yet he still gets to be a saint. Luther might have as well. But it was this printing press, the social media of its time, that spread this all across Germany and began to spark protests and problems. So a heresy case against Luther was initiated in 1520. The Pope, Leo X, one of the Medici and one of the more corrupt ones, issued a papal bull, Exsurge Domine, which ordered Luther to at once recant or be excommunicated. And excommunication was really the worst thing the church could do next to burning you at the stake, though technically the church was not allowed to burn or execute anybody. You can find out about that in my lecture on the medieval church. Excommunication was you would have no contact with anyone. Also, no communion, no confession, no anything, for you could not be buried. Essentially, it's designed to ensure that you could never get into heaven. You might get into purgatory, but you'd never get out. More likely, you'd be in hell forever. What did Luther do about it? he immediately and very publicly burned it. Fie on you, O Pope! The next year, in 1521, at the Diet of Worms, which, by the way, is not like the Atkins diet. It's not that kind of diet. It's more of a council at the city of Worms in Germany. In front of the papal legate and the emperor, Charles V, Luther refused to recant his positions and was placed under interdict. Everybody in the entire world were forbidden from giving him food, water, or shelter, and he was to be seized on sight and killed. Luckily for him, when this was issued, he was not standing here. He had already disappeared. Now, he disappeared for a number of years. And where did he go? Well, luckily for him, this guy here, Fred the Wise, the Elector of Saxony, there's no kings or dukes that he was called, but as elector, he had the right to elect the Holy Roman Emperor, and there are only a few of these. So Fred the Wise sheltered Luther from the Inquisition in the Wartburg castle under an assumed name. During his time in the Wartburg, Luther translated the New Testament from Latin into German without a dictionary, which was pretty good. He didn't really have any German dictionaries, but he still needed probably a Latin dictionary. But anyway, he also wrote a series of theological treatises on sin, grace, the Mass, confession, monks, and, of course, papal power. Now, here, of course, is Luther's room in the Wartburg Castle, preserved to this day. And this drywall is preserved, plaster, because supposedly at one point, Luther was so frustrated with his translation of the New Testament that he took his inkpot and threw it at this wall. And tourist pilgrims later were shown this, and many would repeatedly go about and press their thumb, take a little bit, wet their thumb and press it against and take it over, as sort of being able to touch the great man. If you're a Catholic, this would be considered a relic. Of course, so many tourists or pilgrims had done this that over the years they had to keep on splashing new ink, but that's another story. While Luther was in the Wartburg, Germany was racked by the Pfaffenkrieg, a rebellion of the Imperial Knights, whose socioeconomic position was declining, caused by rampant inflation stemming from a whole bunch of gold and silver coming from the New World. And times were not good for the Imperial Knights, this hereditary class. Led by Ulrich von Hutten and Franz von Sickingen, two really German names, it caused a good chunk of chaos before it collapsed in 1523. Meanwhile, the Emperor, Chuck V, was at war in Italy with the Holy League of France, Milan, Genoa, Florence, and the Pope, who were all waging war against Chuck himself. In 1525, the Emperor Chuck defeated the French king Francois I at the Battle of Pavia. And in 1527, the Pope himself having turned against him, Chuck sacked Rome and held the Pope captive. And most of the soldiers that went around gleefully sacking Rome were in fact German Lutherans, all too willing to sack the Pope and the Church's possessions. At the same time, in 1526, the Ottoman Turks decisively defeated the Hungarians at the Battle of Mohacs, and in 1527 laid siege to Vienna itself. If Vienna had fallen, the way was open to the Turks to all of Western Europe. But at the last second, Vienna and Europe was saved by the arrival of a Polish-Lithuanian army which kicked the Turks all the way at least back to Hungary. Well, not quite to Constantinople, but at least to Hungary. So, preoccupied with wars and rebellions, when neither Pope nor Emperor did anything to seize Luther, a new movement called Protestantism, protesters, sprang up across Germany, led by radical preachers. Some of these were Luther's friends and colleagues, some were not. And who do we have? Well, this guy here, Phil Melanchthon of Wittenberg, an associate of Luther. This is Marty Bucer of Strasbourg, which at the time was in Germany. Andreas Osiander of Nuremberg. And this guy with the best name of all time, Ulrich Zwingli of Zurich. A Zwingli apparently is now another word for a jelly donut. So anyway, what did they preach? Well, they're preaching that all priests can be married. Before around the year 1100 or so, Catholic priests could in fact get married. Many of them were. Orthodox priests to this day can get married. So the Protestants were preaching the same thing. Second, dissolution of all monasteries, convents, and friaries, and the orders that supported them, seeing this as superfluous and stupid and useless. 3, no statues or images in churches, following one of those commandments of the 10 Commandments, thou shalt have no graven images. Now, the church had done this way back when because pagans were used to, well, they didn't actually worship idols, but they liked statues and pictures of their gods and their temples. So if you simply tried to convert pagans, and most of them did not want to be Christians, and you can find out more about that in my lecture on the Christianization of Rome. Anyway, if they had not done that, you really would not have had Europe convert to Catholicism, to Christianity. But okay. The studying and reading of the Bible, translated into the vernacular, which of course in this case would be German, by all. The Catholic Church to this day does not really emphasize this because there's a lot of verses and words and chapters that seem to contradict each other. And as we will see, you can come up with a lot of really weird groups with weird ideas. The church didn't want you, the layperson, reading on your own because you're not really, assuming that you even could read, and a good chunk of people could, but still, you didn't read everything, you didn't have the background, the commentary, and a lot of these would lead people into heresy. Peter Waldo, you could find him in the Middle Ages. Yes, we found Waldo. He was one of them, the Henricians and others, again in my lecture on medieval heresies. That's what happened. Anyway, all church services would be in the vernacular. In other words, German, French, English, whatever, not Latin. Made sense. The original church services in the West were in Latin in the Roman Empire because that's what people spoke. In the eastern half of the empire, they were in Greek. Why? Because that's what people spoke. Number 6, participation by both clergy and laity in the Eucharist. Before then, only the clergy got to have a taste of the body and blood of Christ. The wafer and the wine only went to the priest. The regular people didn't get it. 7, the ability of anyone to preach and teach if inspired by God, and not just ordained ministers. And again, the Catholic Church was leery of this because oftentimes you could have people preaching all sorts of crazy stuff. God spoke to me and said we should kill all the prostitutes. What? Is that God or is that Satan talking to you? This may be a problem. 8. The non-existence of both purgatory and limbo. Purgatory is not mentioned in the Bible, nor is limbo. The Orthodox don't really have a concept of purgatory. So you either have a choice. You go to heaven or you go to hell. And if you follow the book of Revelation, literally only 144,000 will ever get into heaven. Which means virtually nobody got in. But the church, under the various church doctors, Augustine and Ambrose and Greg the Great and the rest, had gradually come up with this idea of purgatory, which was somewhat supported by parts of the Bible. Anyway. And finally, for 9, the where, when, and necessity of sacraments such as confession, ordination, last rites, baptism, and communion. Throughout Germany, radical sects emerged, led by even more radical preachers, rejecting any kind of governance over their flocks by either church or state. And what did these preach? These are preaching abolition of all property, because after all, in the Bible, Adam and Eve did not own property. So should any of us own property? No. Equality of all classes. So whether you're a duke, a king, an emperor, a pope, a bishop, a priest, a preacher, or the lowliest ditch digger, you're all equal in the sight of God. You're all brothers and sisters in the sight of God. But we'll have a totally classless society. Personal revelation. God comes to me and I speak. Well, maybe God has spoken to you. Maybe you're just crazy. Or maybe it's Satan. A prophetic calling. A prophet doesn't just have to be a priest. Adult baptism, which I explain a bit more about in my lecture on the Counter-Reformation. If you're a baby, you don't know any of this stuff. Some even advocated polygamy. After all, Abraham was married to more than one woman, as was Jacob and Isaac and many of the other patriarchs in the Bible. Why shouldn't we? Also, abolition of marriage. People just have sex with whoever they please. So who were these much more radical preachers? Well, some of them are Thomas Munzer and Bernd Knipperdolling. Well, and I thought my name was bad. Why don't you imagine your name was Knipperdolling? These are founded the Prophets of Zwickau. Menno Simmons here. Ooh, he doesn't like it. Who founded the Mennonites. These will become the Amish. Let's see. Jan Bokelson, Felix Mons. We don't have the other picture of him. Felix Mons, Anabaptists. These are the ones who began eventually to preach polygamy and communism. They eventually become today's Baptist. Melchior Hoffmans, Melchiorites, Jakob Hutters, Hutterites, and my favorite Protestant sect, the Adamites. These were fundamentalist, puritanical, nudist. Yes, they held all their services in the nude. But nothing crazy, there's no orgy going on here, because after all, they are Puritans and they are fundamentalist. Then, in 1525, inspired by the preaching of these Protestant ministers, the German Peasants War broke out. Really the last of the great medieval peasant risings, of which had started back right after the Black Plague. Anyway, the peasants aimed to end both serfdom and private property through attacking, pillaging, raping, and killing their lords and their property. Mostly, notice this is where it's taking place, Western Germany through here, and the south along the Tyrol and Bavaria. But when Luther denounced the rebels' demands for equality as an affront to a divinely ordained socio-political order, Luther was actually, for all his radicalism, was actually quite conservative in some ways. The rebellion was smashed. This ensured the continuance of serfdom in Germany into the 19th century, and the establishment of Lutheranism as a conservative upholder of the established order. Luther then established his own Lutheran church with services in German, using the Bible translated into German by himself, and married clergy appointed by the local ruler, as advised by Lutheran bishops. And all the nuns in the convents were turned out and were no longer allowed to be nuns. They were all married off. Luther himself married a very young nun. Of course, the Lutherans will follow our very patriarchal. They mostly are emphasizing the very patriarchal Old Testament. So the women, the nuns, didn't really have much of a say in whether they were to be married or not. To train these ministers, the Lutherans established universities at Marburg, Königsberg, and Jena to join Wittenberg. In 1529, Philip, the Landgrave of Hesse, convened the Colloquy of Marburg, because there were all these Protestant groups, and he felt there should be a unified Protestant church with a unified theological doctrine and message in order to counter the Catholics. But there was a dispute between Luther and Zwingli over the nature of the Eucharist. Was the bread and wine offered up at the service, the Mass, literally or only symbolically transubstantiated into the body and blood of Christ? The Catholic position was and is that the bread and wine literally is transubstantiated. In other words, literally becomes the body and blood of Jesus. And that was Luther's position, but Zwingli said, no, it's only symbolic. And this dispute, and both could point to passages in the Bible that supported their position. This, however, irrevocably split Protestantism and really doomed it to never being a unified movement or a unified doctrine. As the German princes embraced Protestantism, some seem to have been more attracted by being able to seize church property for themselves. Good excuse. In 1531, they formed the Schmalkaldic League. What a great name. Based on the town of Schmalkald. What a great name. Against the emperor, who then concluded a truce with them, hoping that they yet might return to the fold. Besides, he needed money and men from them to fight the Turks and the French. For in 1530, even though the Turks had lost at Vienna, they renewed attacks on Italy, Spain, and Malta. They even took the town of Otranto in Italy for a short time. They renewed their attacks on Malta down here and on Spain, mostly led by Caradin, leading the Emperor Chuck V to attack the Turkish holdings in North Africa. He took Tunis in 1535, but failed to take Algiers in 1541, mostly because at that point the French attacked him. It's always so damn French with this thing. At the conclusion of the French War, 2 years in 1544, Chuck returned to Germany, and in 1547, allied with Bavaria, he defeated the Schmalkaldic League at the Battle of Mühlberg and took Wittenberg. Luther, luckily, was dead by now. But after nearly 8 more years of inconclusive warfare, in 1555, the Emperor, Chuck, was forced to conclude the Peace of Augsburg. And the decision was the religion of the local ruler determined the religion of his subjects. So if your ruler, who was Catholic, decides to now become a Calvinist or a Lutheran, you will be as well, or get the hell out. And this is the situation. So the pink, as you see here, is the Lutherans. The yellow, in his case, is the Zwinglians, but also the Calvinists. Calvinists are coming out through here. The blue, light blue, are the Catholics. The greenish, hard to see where they're at there a little bit here, are Waldensians and Moravians. Well, the Waldensians, this is from Peter Waldo. And the Anabaptists, Socinians, and other anti-Trinitarians are in this sort of lightest yellowish, mostly over here in Moravia. Anyway, that is the situation. The next year, in 1556, worn out, the emperor abdicates to spend the last few years of his life in an abbey in Spain, leaving Spain, Milan, Naples, Burgundy, the Netherlands, and the entire Spanish world empire to his son Phil II, while Austria and the Holy Roman Empire went to his brother Ferdinand. Feeling that he didn't want to send it all to Phil, it was just almost impossible for him to rule an area that big. And besides, his brother wanted something, so that's what happened. Meanwhile, Protestantism received full toleration in Slovenia, Bohemia, Austria, and Poland, and became the only religion in Prussia, up here. England in 1534. Latvia and Estonia, which is up here, in 1539. Scotland in 1560. Sweden in 1527. Denmark, Norway in 1536. Turkish Hungary in 1562. And the Dutch Republic in 1562 as well. Now, I spoke before of Calvinists. So who the hell was John Calvin? Jean Calvin, Frenchman, French preacher, born 1509, died 1564. The most important Protestant preacher, founder, next to Luther. He taught doctrines based on God's omnipotence, predestination, and the unconditional obedience that all humans owe to God. And as a result of this, which was in many ways quite heretical, was forced to flee to Geneva in what's now Switzerland by the Inquisition. Invited by the city leaders, he set up a theocracy requiring, upon pain of severe financial and physical penalties, everybody had to attend religious services 2 or 3 hours worth every damn day. No gambling, no dancing, no swearing, no drinking whatsoever. No images, candles, or altars in the churches. Strict morality. Anybody who commit adultery or fornicated, premarital sex, were killed. Lengthy preaching and witnessing in church every day, which really cut into the working hours. And forced conversion or expulsion of Catholics and seizure of all their property. In other words, making a religion as pretty much as dull as possible. Under Calvin, Geneva, which is right here, becomes a leading center of Protestantism. Again, there are others here, but now its university in Geneva began to train generations of preachers who spread Calvinism across Europe. And again, who are mostly the Calvinists? Largely the Dutch and the Scots. And then, as we'll see in the lecture on the religious wars, the French Huguenots. The wrap-up quote. Consider that for each and every mortal sin, it is necessary to undergo 7 years of penitence after confession and contrition, either in this life or in purgatory. But with these confessional letters, you will be able at any time in life to obtain full indulgence for all penalties imposed upon you. Therefore, throughout your whole life, whenever you wish to make confession, you may receive the same remission of sins, no matter, of course, how awful or how evil they were. And at the hour of death, you will receive a full indulgence as to all penalties and sins, and your share of all spiritual blessings that exist in the church and all its members will come to you. Fra Tetzel in 1517. Oh, I probably shouldn't get in the way of Jesus there. Let me know what you think of this quote. Whether it's true or not, outrageous or, it's no big deal, in the comment section below. Also, what you liked about the video, and what other historical topics or subjects you'd like to see in future videos. Be sure to hit like, share, and subscribe, as it will help me bring you more great videos. And click on that little bell thingy so you'll know when the next History Waits for No One video is posted. If you want to know more, there are recommended studies on this topic in the description below, along with other ways to connect with me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the past.